since I know that not many of you probably have been to the Franklin Institute, just wanted to start with a very quick overview of where I sit. We are a science museum that actually has been through many different iterations of what kind of institution we are. We actually started out as a drafting school. We have been research labs. Um, we have been policy advisors, but today we really focus on our museum and community programming around science and technology. And so our mission, again, is to really inspire a passion for learning. It is very cool that we also happen to have the National Memorial to Benjamin Franklin in our building, which you can see here activated in the way that we like to think Benjamin Franklin would appreciate. um, we are the most visited cultural institution in Pennsylvania, so our appeal really goes beyond science, but really just bringing people together to have fun, to think about science in a social way. And we try to infuse that into programming that we deliver for youth, families, educators, professionals, scientists, not only within the museum, but also in the community and through national networks. And I can talk more about that if people have questions. So just to give you a sense of like how I structured this talk, I wanted to give you a little bit about my background and fill in some of the details that Erin kind of gave you the highlights of. But I think that helps think about how we transition from the science research world into more of the community engagement side of things, and hopefully that maybe helps you understand my perspective as well. And then talking a little bit about what is that continuum of community engagement? What does that mean? What does it look like? I wanted to talk through some case studies of the type of work that I do and where that falls along that continuum. Some lessons along what we've learned, and then finally, I'll just open it up for discussion. I will say that there are people who are really studying the practice of community engagement from a both a theoretical point of view as well as side of like a social science point of view. I am not one of those people, so the perspective that I bring to you today is really that of a practitioner. And I hope that I can kind of give you a taste of what community engagement looks like, but know that this kind of work is really grounded on an entire foundation of a lot of solid research and evidence-based practice that I am not going to touch on. So consider this your gateway into that world of community engagement. So first, just a little bit about me. Erin mentioned sort of where I gotten my degrees. But I think what I really appreciated about the way that my education evolved is that throughout I was always able to combine my interest in science with my interest in education and communication. So as an undergrad, I did 3.5 years of research in a developmental biology lab working on fruit flies. For anybody working on fruit flies, they're an amazing model system. If I still did research, I'd work on them again in a heartbeat. Um, but what I think what the value that I took out of that experience was really more about the importance of participation in science. Like none of my experiments really worked. It was real terrible. But I did science. I worked with scientists. I was in a lab. I was doing experiments, and that was really cool. Just being part of that world. Um, at the same time, because my experiments weren't working, I also took a break for summer and ended up as a science camp counselor for a day camp, and that was probably my first job in what we call informal science education. And so bringing that spirit of doing science into a summer camp setting and working with kids and getting them involved was a way that I was able to connect those two parts of my interests. And so I continued that when I went to grad school. I did my PhD in evolutionary biology again, as Erin had mentioned. And what was fascinating to me about evolutionary biology is that it was a way to connect the mechanisms of biology with the world that I saw around me. And so having that kind of grounding of like not staying only in the bench, but collecting field specimens and thinking about how do we analyze that to understand what we see around us. And at the same time, I was also doing science writing, and I was also working with middle school teachers to develop lessons around evolution. So again, continually trying to bridge what I was doing in the lab with ways to participate and engage the community in thinking about those. And then this was really the pivotal moment of my career decision was that in 2004 and 2005, there was a trial about teaching evolution in schools in Pennsylvania. And along with all of the press attention, around the science, there was a lot of discussion of these statistics about science education and, how people, what percent of Americans didn't believe or didn't understand in science. And as an evolutionary biologist, that was what made me realize that like, yes, I can stay in the lab and try to put these, these feelers out and connections out to my community, but there are problems that I can't solve by doing it in that model. Like I need a different model to have a bigger impact. And so I ended up doing a fellowship through the National Academy of Sciences. I think it still exists, although it's still it's in a reorganization season right now, but putting it out there in case anybody's interested. But at the time, the National Academies had their own little science museum. And that was where I discovered the professional world of science museums and realized, like, yeah, this is my jam. And so I came back to Philadelphia because I'd already had a postdoc lined up at Penn. I was working again back on fruit flies and thinking about how they overwinter. Again, cool evolutionary problem. But at the same time, I was volunteering at the Natural History Museum in Philadelphia. Again, trying to keep that bridge alive until I could figure out some way to make it come together. And so I got lucky because the Franklin Institute had just started working on a plan to develop an exhibit about the brain. And they needed an exhibit developer. So all of those kind of parallel paths that I had put into motion came together. And I was able to, get a foot in the door as an exhibit developer for this exhibit. Um, what was cool is that because we were really one of the earliest, museums to do an exhibit that embraced neuroscience, like, there's a lot of, illusions and psychology exhibits out there, but we really embraced neuroscience as a way to engage our audience into thinking about current science, and how that informs the decisions that we make today and the world we're gonna live in the future. It ended up being a wonderful bridge back to the research community. And I like to think that, like, just by, working on this exhibit, I kind of ended up doing a second PhD in neuroscience. But it really opened up a lot of doors to do neuroscience engagement in many different creative ways. And so in addition to the exhibit, here's a picture of another, gallery in the exhibit, in addition to what's, in my background. Um, but we've worked with probably thousands of teachers now to help them understand the brain science of learning, um, and how that, either strengthens or maybe busts some myths, about, how they teach and their practices. We've done a lot of community engagement around neuroscience and ethics. I worked with a previous civic science fellow on developing tools for engaging community audiences and those kinds of conversations with scientists. And this might be my favorite one-off thing that I've done is the Philadelphia Flower Show is an annual, like it's a huge event happening right now actually. But a couple of years ago, one of the floral designers was inspired by the brain exhibit to design her display at the flower show around the brain. And so I got a chance to work with her to make sure the science was accurately represented in this incredible display that she put together. Um, and so it's really, one of my favorite things about neuroscience is just how many connections there are to things that people are doing in their everyday life. And so there's so many opportunities to bring that idea of community engagement into neuroscience. That said, I work at a science museum and we pretty much cover topics across the board. So I am going to move a little bit away from specifically focusing on neuroscience and some of the case studies that I talk about, but wanted to kind of set up this story to just with my origins in the brain exhibit to hopefully give you a vision of like how you can apply these principles of community engagement kind of independent of what your topic is. So let's kind of back up for a minute and think about, what is community engagement and why does it matter? Um, One of the resources that I will recommend a couple of things from in my talk today is the National Informal STEM Education Network. This is a nationwide group of researchers, practitioners from museums, universities, other types of learning spaces that really come together to develop tools and resources for informal science education and informal science education practice. So this graphic is from one of the reports that the NICE network put together around broadening participation. In just to kind of level set the stage for why it's important to go beyond your walls, right? Like, we think that, we like to have a diverse perspective in our museum, but even that within our museum, we're all still starting with the museum perspective. And so bringing in community members, and you can define community however you want, has all of these different benefits that you don't get when you're just kind of working with an institutional team. Um, and as you can read these that those benefits are really can be challenging in the short term to navigate, and I'll get to some of those challenges a little bit later. Um, but at the end of the day, it creates a more authentic product that has a much better chance of sustainability and impact. So there are a variety of versions of this diagram. I picked this one for the talk just because it's one of the simplest. But if you look up community engagement spectrum, this is a concept that was defined or I guess explained by the International Association for Public Participation. So you can use this, in civic life, in policy making. In this case, we're going to interpret it in the context of informal education and public engagement. Um, but what you can see in this spectrum is that on the left side here is really a one-way directionality and it's not even really engagement, right? It's just like we have information, we're going to give it to you. Um, there's still a lot of room for that kind of a format. So it's not to say that that is bad, right? There is a place for that, 100%. Yet, as we think about that richer spectrum of experiences that you can create and those benefits that you get out of collaboration, you move towards the right-hand side of the spectrum. Thinking about, consulting, that's like getting feedback from people, that but the process is still kind of driven, by you and your institution. If you go more towards involve, now it's more than maybe just one or two touch points. It's a continued check-in. So to think about, okay, let's try something, let's get some feedback on it. Okay, did that work? Maybe we'll tweak it based on some more feedback. Um, so there again, it's more consistent engagement. As we move to collaborate, now we're really getting into thinking about how do we bring people in as part of the process. It's not just kind of a checkpoint, to make sure we're on the right track, but really like help us figure out what are the problems that we're trying to solve. And then finally, empowerment, and sometimes this is also referred to as shared leadership, is that now you're equal partners. So you're making decisions together. It can be to the point where the community is the one that defines the deliverable, and the institution is just there to make that happen. So there are different models of what that looks like. Sometimes it is a more shared version. Sometimes it really is like full on empowerment. And that decision can depend on a number of different constraints. But hopefully that, that idea of like there's a space for all of these, and sometimes the first thing is like, okay, where do I start? What makes the most sense? So let me kind of bring those to life through 5 case studies that kind of address each one of those. So I'll start with the brain exhibit. Um, because when I reflect back on how we created that exhibit, it was very much an informed mindset. um, when we put together an advisory board for the exhibit, it was 13 neuroscientists. If I redid that process today, it's not what I would do. And you'll see some other examples of how we've shifted things a little bit. But it was very much in the informed mindset because, like, as somebody newly coming out of academia, that was my training. Is that I know science. I want other people to know science. Let me get other people. Let's get more scientists in the room and figure out what kind of science we should tell people. That's not great. But what is cool about neuroscience is that it is inherently participatory because everybody has their own brain and everybody has their own experience with their brain that they are bringing into the exhibit with them. So even though we approached the project from this sort of direction of informing, it ended up being a very participatory experience in spite of that, because people have their own perspectives that they're bringing with it. So, I think that's a note of encouragement that sometimes, like, even if you don't plan for, for community engagement, it happens anyway, but it's probably better if you design for it from the get-go. But in this case, like, we looked at, how did we start this? We didn't really we did a couple of focus groups just to get a sense of like what people's misconceptions were about the brain or maybe what they already knew about the brain. Um, but we weren't really getting at like what are you wondering about the brain? It was like, okay, how do we what do we identify as the most important concepts in neuroscience and how do we turn that into an exhibit? Again, luckily it worked out because people are bringing their own, interpretation with them, and that ends up working out really well. Since then, we have shifted our exhibit development process, a little bit further right, on that community engagement spectrum. And, and what you'll see in this set of case studies that I'm talking about is that exhibits are the hardest thing to do from like a full-on community engagement, like all the way to the right of the spectrum, because there are so many constraints around an exhibit, whether you're talking about budgets, whether you're talking about infrastructure, whether you're talking about, fundraising, that making an exhibit that is fully community empowered is really challenging. So thinking about the type of project that you're doing and what's appropriate for that project is something that's really important. So for our exhibits now, we're really more in the consult mode where we do a lot of community focus groups and discussions at the early stages of the project to really help us shape what the storyline and the narrative of the exhibit will be. In this case, this is a picture of our new Body Odyssey exhibit, which is about human health that we opened up in 2024. And when we talked to kids, middle and high school kids, before we started the process, what we heard from them was that mental health was like the most important topic that they were interested in learning about. And so we ended up designing a full gallery about mental health because that's what we heard from them. So that's an example of, I think a successful consult model where, you don't go in knowing that like, okay, we will just like let you design the exhibit. But knowing that this is so important, we will make sure that the exhibit addresses that and engages you in what you're interested in learning. Moving to the next point on the spectrum, on the involve side of things, this is a picture from a project that we did called the Children's Vaccine Education Project. This is something that we did in 2022 and 23. We were part of a public health initiative that was really trying to boost vaccination rates among children in under-vaccinated communities. And so this was a project that we did in collaboration with school and community nurses. And so we were really involving them in every step of saying, here's a prototype of something that you might try in a classroom or a community setting. What do you think? Give us feedback. And then we iterated on that, and then trained them on how to use the activities. They gave us more feedback. So again, it's that iterative process of like, we're still kind of directing the project, but they're involved at every step of the way, from designing the materials to telling us whether the training was effective, to then telling us what they were hearing from their communities. Moving again one step further, this is a pilot project that we actually did with a local health promotion nonprofit organization. So what we heard from them was that they do a lot of work, with middle school and high school students around topics in health, but they didn't really have a lot of interactive hands-on activities about health. A lot of it is very kind of like, let me just tell you what to do and what not to do when it comes to healthy behaviors. And they really wanted to get more engagement with their with the audiences and the students that they were working with. And so this is a real collaboration because they were able to identify sort of these are the weakest points in the curriculum that we teach. This is what we see is like where kids aren't really getting this idea, or they're not making this connection. And so how can we work together to address those needs that they identified? So again, now you're starting to see the shift in like whose goals are we prioritizing? Here we really have shared goals, where they've identified these health educators have identified a need. We have skills to offer to help them fill that gap. And we really work together to develop some new resources for them to teach. In this case, on the left, this is an activity about getting kids to understand all the different elements that we need to make strong bones. And on the right, this is one about like modeling how dopamine works in our brain, when you're using substances versus not, in terms of its effect on decision making. So that's kind of a good example of the collaborate model where we're kind of each identifying our own strengths and then bringing them together. And then finally, the project that I'll talk about as the most on the empowerment side is actually our civic science fellow Jessica Vaden, her project, which was to work with a cohort of middle school teachers to develop new curriculum resources around environmental literacy and sustainability. And so we went into this really with the attitude that you tell us what you need. We knew that there was an opportunity here because Pennsylvania just introduced new science standards in 2022, 23, somewhere out or very recently. And there's a whole component around environmental literacy and sustainability that didn't quite line up with the national science standards. And so there's a gap, there was a need here, but we didn't want to be the ones to say this is what you need. So we really let them tell us what kind of resources do they need, what kind of community connections do they see, what kinds of storylines are going to be relevant to their students, and we really built a whole set of curriculum resources that served the needs that they had identified, and that they had a voice in, more than a voice, really. They co-developed, the conceptual aspects of this whole curriculum suite. And then we kind of filled in the details and developed out the resources that were originally based on their ideas. So this is an example of furthest along the spectrum where their priorities, their needs really drove the project. And we brought our civic science lens, our strengths in developing curriculum and hands-on activities to support their process. So hopefully those 5 case studies kind of give you a better picture of what those different points along that community engagement spectrum refer to. So I wanted to wrap up with talking about some of the lessons that we've learned with doing these projects. And so if we kind of look at the co-creation, collaboration process at a very high level, we like to think about it in these 3 stages of understand, imagine, and build. So I'll go through each of these kind of 3 buckets of the process, and I'll kind of share one reflection about like the product or kind of like the goal of the project, as well as one reflection about the process. Because when you're working with a community partner, the process is almost just as important as the product. And I think that is like, if that's one thing you take away, it is the sort of that importance of process. Um, so first, from the understand point of view, you always recommend that you start small to ensure that you can work together. And this might be like making sure that you have shared goals, that your perspectives are complementary and not in competition, right? Because you have to think about what is my role in the community space that we're playing, and what is my partner's role in the community, and does it make sense for us to work together? Or are we potentially in conflict? You also want to make sure that you can actually both do a project. um, Aligning capacity and structure. And so I put this image here. This is from a collaboration that we did with another public health organization during COVID to try and get out and to try and just share information about the vaccines. And there were a lot of good reasons to work together, but what we found out was that the public health organization that we were working with just worked on a very different time frame than we did. Like, they were an emergency response organization. We are not. They were in a place where they had staffed up, right, because of a pandemic. We had cut 3/4 of our staff. So just in terms of the pace at which we could work was not aligned. So we tried it. We realized that like we are not aligned in this way. Like, let's I'm glad we did this, but this is like this is not something that we build on. So even something like that practical. Thinking about the resources that you have and what incentive each partner needs to make the collaboration worth their while. So this could be money, right? Like, is there a grant funding? Can you pay stipends to everybody in a way that is fair, that values their time? And is it worth it? Or is one partner getting more out of it than the other, and that's an imbalance? And finally, just discussing the ownership and authorship from the get-go. This was something that we found was really important with the teachers that we worked with in our civic science project, is that they wanted to know from the very first meeting, like, how they would be credited. Because many of them had experiences, and this is not uncommon, where they've been promised a collaboration that then never like is not evenly or honestly honored in the final product. So having that conversation at the beginning is also very worthwhile. From a process point of view, understanding each other as people is incredibly important. You can't just jump into the work because you have to build relationships and understand, what people's lived experiences is. Where are they? What are they? What challenges are they facing in their work, in their life? who are they? Why do they do this work? Understanding each other's motivation. And so we spend a lot of time early in the process, giving people an opportunity to introduce themselves to each other. This is one of my favorites. We just have a ginormous bin of like random Lego minifig parts. um, and we just have people like build their brick self, and it could be, themselves, as they are. It could be themselves as they want to be. It's a very creative way to then, introduce yourself to somebody through this, through this little like physical avatar that also gives you an opportunity to like rummage through things and like, hey, like, hey, I found this weird piece. What do you think it is? So even just the process of building your brick self is fun, and it introduces joy and collaboration into the process that really sets a tone for moving forward. All right, now let's think about the imagine part of this. And this is kind of the hardest part because you might not know what you're going to create. You're coming together because, hopefully you know what your goals are, but you're not coming in with like, and this is what we're going to do to accomplish them. I will say this makes it really hard to write grant proposals about co-creation projects because you say that like, well, we don't know yet. And funders don't really love that. This is what I love about the Civic Science Network is there is an appreciation of that messiness and fuzziness. Um, but but you don't know what the thing is. You're really building the plane as you're flying it, and that can be very uncomfortable for everybody. Um, and so it's important to make sure that you're kind of building that vision up together. And so having opportunities to reflect on what strengths and resources each partner is bringing to the goals before you get into like, oh, we're gonna make a kit or a curriculum. Like, no, 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 no. Like, let's get less concrete. What are you good at? What do you like to do? What can you bring from your past experience that can help us towards these goals? And then we'll figure out what the thing is. Again, what is most important, for the project? Because again, like what the thing is ideally at the sweet spot at the intersection of, the each partner's strengths and resources. And then finally, sort of, again, figuring out where is their agreement, where do we differ, where's we use this kind of like target exercise to help people prioritize things. And like, you start looking at what's in the center of each organization's radar and like, okay, that's going to help us develop a vision for what we're going to build together. But the important thing is that because there isn't sort of a structure coming into it, you really want to make sure that everybody has a chance to have their voice heard. And so, I always like to refer people to this website of Liberating Structures. It's also a book. I don't know if anybody has, hopefully people have heard of it because it's been around for a while. But it's a great toolkit of facilitation strategies for making sure that you're hearing everybody's voices and how you're distilling these kind of big fuzzy ideas into something that's concrete. At the same time, it is also important to establish those shared norms of like, what does this imagining process look like? It matters that like, okay, we all commit to like being in the moment. We commit to, listening and sharing ideas. It matters that we all want to hear from each other, that we give feedback honestly, but that we're solutions oriented. So, you can and leaving space for coming up with other kinds of norms in the moment. That it's not just like, okay, here's a checklist of things we have to do. Now let's move on. But that you take time to be intentional about deciding those norms together, because these are again what will facilitate that kind of collaboration in a productive way. All right, then you get to the build section. And you come up with this idea of what you want to do and you're trying to you're trying to develop it together. It's not going to work the first time. So this is another tool that we like to use from the NISE network a lot. It's called team-based inquiry. It feel like the overarching structure is pretty common sense, but there are a lot of like helpful worksheets and things like that to work through like, okay, what do we want to learn at each step of the process? Knowing that neither partner or any of the partners know the answers ahead of time. So it's really important to test things like with your audiences, and get feedback from them, and then figure out, okay, how are we going to change things? How are we going to improve it? And be committed to learning from all sides. And then finally, it's important, again, on the process side as well, to get feedback and be humble. And this is especially important if the job of facilitation is in one organization's court, because there's a certain power structure that is inherent in facilitation, that you have to be very mindful of. If one even if the work is being co-led, if there's one person who's like driving the process, then you want to make sure you're getting feedback on that process. Right? So obviously you want to know what's going well, but also like what gives people the ick. And we literally like just put this question of like what gave you the ick or felt uncomfortable. Because there are these sort of intangible things that like might not feel right. And it's important to identify those early. And it could be something like, I didn't like this activity because it made me feel uncomfortable. It could be like this person talks too loud. And that makes for just like an uncomfortable dynamic in the room. We've heard everything. But just giving people the space to voice their discomfort with the process, and being open to that, is really important. This is the kind of stuff that we do at a closing survey after every single session. Maybe, again, like bringing in opportunities for people to say things that they didn't get to say, sort of in the formal, discussion. And then what do you want to do next? Right. So again, building the plane as they're flying it, it's also about the process. Is like, what do you want to do next time? And so always thinking about how are we going to make changes, um, in terms of the process as well as the products you're designing, is something that's really important. And you can use team-based inquiry as a template for that as well. So I will stop there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. But I would love to hear your questions and reflections.